What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here, and patch 11.21 is coming for League of Legends, and this video is going to be as janky as this looks and sounds. I brought two different headsets, neither of which microphones work, so we're using the inbuilt laptop microphone. I know I'm quiet. It's 9 p.m. in Germany, and Raz is over there, and Kobe's over there. I realized first time it was off camera, Raz is behind that wall, so I'm not going to talk that loudly. I'm sorry this is annoying. Hopefully there's not a lot of background noise in the microphone. As far as I could test, it wasn't too bad. This all looks janky because for some reason I can't get OBS to record any windows on this laptop. I don't know why it's all broken, but it's all broken. It's the only video I'm going to record here. I mean, maybe 22 hits while I'm still here. Anyway, let's go to the patch rundown. So, first things first, Akshan is getting nerfed. He is doing quite well. Of course, disabled for the World Championships, we don't know if he'd be OP for Pro, but his Emax win rate is still his highest, and so this is actually dropping his Emax down to only tripling the damage of the base rank of the ability. That said, there's a bunch of other scaling levers, so you know, it's kind of okay if it doesn't scale the hardest with ability rank. And again, the win rate for Emax is, I want to say, about 2% higher than Qmax. And I know at least one of the designers is, when he kind of gets the chance, it feels like he tries to move champions into a spot where there's a bit more ability rank up choice, which when you're given the opportunity to do so, I think is really cool. So there's some Xayah buffs later, which I believe are from the same designer, which makes Qmax second maybe a possibility. I know this is the third time I think that he's maxing Xayah Q, buffing Xayah Q, but I think it's kind of cool. So I'm a big fan of like those kinds of changes. So yeah, again, Akshan Emax is doing too well. Akshan Qmax was meant to be the kind of more honest gameplay. Like that was, I think, kind of the expected build of the champion. Maybe the gameplay team already knew that, but they didn't think the winner difference could be that big. I don't know, but anyway, yeah. Nerfing Emax seems reasonable. So as I said, it's going to be very janky. So this is how we're doing all the stuff. Yeah, I know it's trash. I don't have anything better than this. So yep, if you max E first, obviously you lose the damage pretty much right away. If you max second, it's not quite so bad. Which means, yeah, Qmax, Akshan doesn't get nerfed nearly as hard, though obviously still gets nerfed. And we move on to the next change, which is Graves. Graves is obviously doing very well. What's interesting is, this is something that is a little weird to me. I wish Riot would put a flag in the ground a bit more of what they want out of Graves. And what I mean by that is, this is a champion where at one point they had buffed his MR scaling because he wasn't getting played in the jungle, and they're like, well, okay, he needs to be a more well-rounded champion, so he has to be good, you know, against magic damage sometimes, but also, you know, really should be an anti-AD focused champion. So he has more MR than every ranged champion. He also has more armor than every range champion. And it's like, so where's the strength and weakness exactly? Like Quick Draw used to give MR, and then Riot got rid of that for good reasons. And then it's like, but we're gonna buff your MR scaling, so it's not so bad. So I don't know. It just feels kind of weird to me. I really don't feel like Graves Jungle needs good MR. Graves Limit obviously get countered better if he had low MR. I wish they would just bring that back and just say, nope, you have range champion MR, deal with it. Maybe it is actually back to nerf, but I know for a while it was high. In general, it's a kind of whatever thing. I'm kind of just whining. I also don't believe this nerf is very meaningful. Now that said, Riot would have data on, the effects of quick draw armor nerfs, because quick draw armor has changed several times over the course of Graves' life cycle. So they probably do have some data on how much quick draw armor matters. That said, I really don't believe that 2 armor per stack is that meaningful. Keep in mind that he gets 2 stacks automatically. If he dashes forward, he can refresh the stacks by hitting monsters and hitting enemy champions, not minions. And then obviously you can get up to 8 stacks, meaning it can be a 16 armor nerf, which is obviously quite meaningful. That said, 8 stack quick draw is very, 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 very rare. The reason I find this kind of strange is basically the fact that we're seeing Graves at Worlds a fair bit, and people are picking AD champs into Graves more often than not, right? We're seeing, I think we saw a Wukong once, we're seeing Jace a fair bit, we're not seeing that much Kennen, I mean, we never see top Rise, but, you know, it's not like we're seeing, you know, Maokai's and stuff, and, you know, we're only seeing so many AP junglers. It seems to me as though, the idea that Graves could be kind of a magic damage is not happening here. So even though this champion has this, really high armor growth through quick draw, turns out he has really high baseline armor and MR values. So it's not that, the quick draw buff is a lie. Like anytime that, an ability says, hey, by the way, you're really good at X, like Wukong has armor and health regen when he damages people. If he ends up having the lowest armor in the game after the passive, something is wrong and the game is lying to you. Wukong is actually not a good armor champion. Wukong is not lying to you. He does have good armor if he deals damage basically at all. Same with health regen, it's fine. His in-combat health regen is quite high. Obviously, the out-of-combat health regen makes sense if it's kind of low. Like, it's not a big deal. In the Graves case, though, like, yes, he in fact does have very high armor, and yet people are picking 80 matchups into him. Now, maybe that means pro teams are dumb, and there's a case for that, but it also means that if they're not going to AP champions, that means Graves is not sufficiently weak to magic damage, and I think that is a mistake. Where you have an ability that literally reads, I have exactly only bonus armor, he should probably have bad MR. So that feels a little unfortunate to me. I would have loved them to probably go back and do some MR nerfs, but whatever. Anyway, as far as the actual math is concerned, here you go. Here is on one stack, which is him just like dashing to the side and like taking damage from raptors or whatever. And then here's the physical durability when he's actually at max stacks of all 8. Of course, keep in mind again the armor nerf is flat. It's 2 or 8 or 2 or 16 based on the number of stacks. As time goes on, obviously, as you get more ranks in the ability, it matters less. As you get more levels in the champion, and thus your base armor goes up, it matters less. But yeah, Graves has really, 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 really high base armor and quick draw, which just feels weird to me. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of you having the highest base stats and also the ability, right? I'm okay with you being average and having the ability, but again, it's a really minor quibble. It's not the most important thing about the game, just a little annoying to me because I feel like that should be more intentional. But yep, Graves certainly, if he does get to max stacks, is a lot squishier, especially earlier on. This doesn't mean very much for late game, which also means, by the way, that this tends to nerf pro more than solo queue, just because pro is more early game focused. All right, next up we have Jinx getting 3 different buffs. And the total attack speed modifier after Get Excited goes from 15 to 20%, which is like an 8% more damage while under Get Excited, which is pretty good. Right, going from 115 to 125 is pretty meaningful, to be clear. Flame Charmer's 25 range. All this really does, the intent is that it now matches the range of Rocket Launcher, just as a feels good thing, so you don't, walk forward to cast Flame Chompers on someone that you're already auto-attacking. That'd feel pretty bad, so okay, that seems pretty reasonable. Very small buff, though. Get Excited, obviously, quite nice. That said, Teamfight Snowballing tends to be, I want to say, solo queue focused, more so than pro, so some worries that, and I believe Jinx is doing fine. I don't believe Jinx is underpowered, but I could be wrong about that, right? Like, it might be that Jinx is underpowered in solo queue, and so they're doing buffs, but I don't believe that's true. I didn't look, though, sorry. The other exciting one is Super Mega Death Rocket getting a moderate cooldown decrease. I believe that's 90 to 60, becomes 75 to 55, so not too bad there. We can go ahead and show what the differences are. Obviously, the other ones aren't really very mathy or worth mathing, so we're not going to do that, but yeah, Rocket cooldown, as we typo it, and it's cooldownwa. Sorry, it's an image, so there's no way to fix that. Reasonable gains here, mostly, again, early-ish focused. The fact that Jinx gets to spam the rocket is a very big deal, though. There's actually one thing that is a big deal in the pro meta, which is at level 8, everyone but the AD carries goes up to the Rift Herald, and everyone fights over Rift Herald. And having a readily accessible ultimate as an AD carry, if your support roams enough, you can be level 6 by 8 minutes on an AD carry. For solos, you get it at 6 minutes. For bot lane, you wouldn't normally get it if you share XP 100% of the time, I believe. But for, if you're support roams enough, you can. And so, this is kind of neat that the idea of, we could play like Thresh Jinx, and, if I roam enough, Jinx can get to 6, and then Jinx can rocket during the Rift Herald fight, and that's just kind of valuable. Rocket spamming in general. More and more the game is becoming AD carries on an island, at least in pro, which I don't mind. I'm like, it fits the function of marksman. This has always been true, that, right, marksmen are the great late game insurance policy. They deal a ton of damage, they scale with items, they don't scale quite as hard with levels, although that's changing based on kits, so asterisk there. The idea being that AD carries, right, they gain attack damage and attack speed with character level, which means by leveling up, they actually do gain pure DPS. On the other side of that one, though, you had mages who got ability ranks they cared about. Like, Jinx doesn't really care about ranking up Flame Chompers. She cares about the AD and AS per level, but, like, that's not that much value. Whereas Syndra, like, actually really cares about rank 2 ultimate. Jinx, by comparison, doesn't care about rank 2 ultimate, right? Syndra cares way more about that. So, idea could be that it still is true for many mages, that mages care more about levels than AD carries, but there is a case that some AD carries care even more about levels than mages do, just because they want the stat profile. That said, the important part here is, again, in the pro meta, AD carries are being left more and more on an island, just to like farm against each other, because look, they're not very volatile, right? They're not going to contribute a lot of kill pressure. They can be attacked, right? They're often fairly squishy, fairly low level, low escape tools. You can go gank an AD carry, but in terms of like doing objectives, teams would generally rather bring their top laners and mid laners and junglers and support because they can roam. They're not beholden to any lane. And if someone's going to just grab scrap farm, it should be an AD carry. And I think that's proper optimization. And so having a low cooldown cross-up ultimate is actually very interesting and could well suit the pro meta. And I find that kind of to be sort of a cool change. So next up, we have Karthus. Karthus has been dominating as a bot laner. He has been for a while. I've called out Karthus bot as an incredibly strong pick for several years. I used him to get the diamond last season. This season I made diamond as a jungler and I decayed, so we'll see if I do it after Worlds or not, or if I just stay plat 1 and, whatever. That'll be my second season ending plat from decay. If it happens, it happens. But yeah, Karthus bot, very, very, very strong. And so doing things like they did with Ziggs, where they're trying to equalize the power levels by pushing some of the spikes later on, trying to nerf the early game, make the mid game good, because okay, a mid laner can maybe get over that hump pretty quickly, but as a bot laner, sharing XP. And one thing to point out, actually, is kind of interesting, is in pro, right? Because so pro isn't quite mirroring solo queue win rates. People are picking some good champions, right? Ziggs is getting played in pro a fair bit. I know there are some teams who have Karthus and Seraphine as other mage bot picks ready, and those are the two of the other three high win rate bot lane mages. Swain is number 4. That's the quadumvirate. I don't know what the 4 version of triumvirate is, but basically, yeah, Ziggs, Karthus, Swain, and Seraphine are the 4 big mage bots. Those are the ones that should be played. The fact that people are going to Syndra and not actually good mages down there is really tilting for pro play, but those are the champions that people should be learning if they want to play mage bot. And those champions all have way higher win rate in bot lane than in mid lane or in jungle, in the case where that's applicable. And so, anyway, I say pro isn't mirroring solo queue because in solo queue these win rates are really, really absurd, and in pro we're not seeing them very much. Which means that either pros are wrong, which to some degree can be true, but not usually to this degree for 2 years. Usually they pick things up by this point in time. The other being that, okay, the strengths don't line up exactly, right? The strengths of these mage bots in solo queue are not strengths that can really be used in pro play, which is also acceptable. Anyway, the point stands that in solo queue, Karthus is going to share XP a lot more than he would in pro play, right? Because if you watched any of Worlds so far, AD carries are frequently out-leveling their mid and top laners because, Leona goes and basically lanes with the Jax and just, Ezreal's down at bot lane free-farming forever. That's just kind of the way pro is going, which means that anything that is a nerf when you're sharing XP for a long time is a nerf for solo queue more than for pro, is me finishing up this thought, which makes these kinds of nerfs that we saw with Ziggs and we see with Karthus, I think, actually pretty smart. So, much like Ziggs' second max, his E was nerfed until max rank, we have Karthus in the same boat, where Defile is restoring less mana until later levels, and here's the data table. Weaker for the first 9 levels of the game, slightly stronger for 10 plus. Obviously, +1 mana per kill is not exactly a very big deal at level 10 and 11, but the numbers do exist. And again, 5 less mana per kill is a very big deal. This really will, I think, do quite a bit to hamper Karthus's pushing ability, his ability to consistently get the lane under turret and then, go roam or let a support roam or whatever. Another thing to point out, though, is this will affect jungle some, obviously. Karthus jungle is mana gated. He cannot leave Defile on while clearing, so this is somewhat of a constraint on him. Karthus jungle, I think, just objectively must lose win rate when doing this. As Karthus levels and he gets, his Leanders or Ludens done or whatever, it's not nearly as big of a problem. But in the early game, you will feel this some, right? When you, kill blue, well, you weren't level 2 yet. When you kill Gromp, it's only 5 mana. Okay, when you kill wolves, now it's 20 mana missing. When you kill raptors, that's 6 pieces? That's another 30 mana missing. And it's look, that's only 2 Defiles, but you're 2 Defiles down, right? You're 3 seconds-ish of Defile or 3 lay wastes or whatever. This isn't trivial. It's not huge, but this objectively lowers this slows the clear speed by a couple seconds. It has to, because Karthus is mana gated, and thus he's going to get fewer spells off, just objectively. So this will nerf Karthus jungle a small amount. It should nerf Karthus bot by quite a bit more. Obviously it's a buff later on, but honestly, Karthus tends to not have any mana constraints later on, which is fine. There's even a very small chance you might see a second rank in E early, at level 3 or something. I doubt that highly, or level 4. I really doubt that'll happen. I don't think it's worthwhile. I think Lay Waste is still just too valuable. In terms of a mana spent per minion killed, it's probably just better that way, and so, the bigger restore is not as good as just killing the minion, in fewer queues, but it's a thought. I don't think it'll happen, though. But yeah, this should be a reasonable nerf to Karthus bot lane. Next up, pretty big buffs to Lux. Apparently Lux isn't doing all that well. So she's getting 1% attack speed per level, which is not bad. One thing to note is that Lux functionally has 7% free attack speed at level 1. So this is not quite as big of a buff as it might look like. It is still pretty meaningful though. She gets, a basically quarter second increased duration on her passive. Okay, that's basically, it's a good change for feels and to kind of have the design of the champion, like make the champ feel good. I'm a fan of that, but, not a big actual buff. But then we get 10 damage and 0.5 AP ratio on the E, and we get, I believe it's 20 to 0 seconds off of the ult cooldown, which is actually pretty meaningful. So let's take a look at the first set of numbers. So this is her attacks per second and her R cooldown. We'll do the E stuff in the next slide. But yeah, you can see, I guess technically the first number should be in yellow, but it doesn't really matter. Again, has 0.669 attacks per second at the very beginning of the game. And then it's only a 15% attack speed increase because even though she gains 17% additive attack speed, the way the scaling is going to work out for the champion, it's more like 15% by the end of the day. Still not a high amount of attack speed. I'm actually of the opinion, and this actually probably isn't true. I would walk this back if I ever did actual design work on this. But I believe that unless you need to build an exception for feels, every champion should hit 1.0 attacks per second at level 18. And essentially, what you're allowed to change the designer is the base attack speed ratio and attack speed level up gain of the champion. And those numbers actually allow you to actually pretty readily tweak how much a champion wants to buy attack speed. So let's say for a champion like Vayne, if her base attack speed was like 0.7, which is very high, you wouldn't give her very much attack speed per level to get to 1.0, which is actually kind of a good thing because it makes further attack speed buys feel really good. Because in general, right, they want to incentivize Vayne buying attack speed. And so the more attack speed per level you give a champion, now certainly the W rank up is worth more than that, so you kind of still win. And you still want to buy things like a, Rage Blade and a Phantom Dance and things like that. But by comparison, right, if you're a champion like Nautilus, who's going to be at, 0.6 or 0.65, it's like, okay, if you really want him to feel slow and give him poor attack speed growth, I accept that. That's actually reasonable for someone like Nautilus or Alistair or Darius and the like. There's actually a case to be made for exceptions. It's like, actually, this champion should feel slow. But for someone like Lux, this is the kind of stuff that gets kind of left behind. And maybe it was meant to be somewhat intentional that it's actually hard to access the passive, but I don't feel like League would design a champion this way, where it's like, yeah, so you have an attack speed pattern, or a gameplay pattern of landing a spell, then landing an auto attack, and manually attacking each minion as it goes. There's no way in 2021 they would ship this champion with 1% attack speed per level. There's no way they would do it, right? There's just absolute, I don't believe that's how they would actually do it. They have low attack speed champions like Akshan because they want that to be the play style, right? They want him to well, no, you double shot, but your attack speed scaling is not high. It's more bursty, it's more kitey, right? It's a very intentional attack speed paradigm. This is hey, Lux, auto attack, it's good. They wouldn't give her low attack speed. There's no way. So that's the kinds of things that when I talk about having a lot of consistency and doing a lot of templating stuff, and anytime I talk about that kind of stuff, it's to kind of remove edge cases like this where Lux should always have had good attack speed growth. And by the way, 2% isn't good attack speed growth, right? 0.838 is not high. But if you're hey, we start at champions going to 1.0 at level 18, or even 0.9 at level 18, and it's but should they have more? Should they have less? And then kind of going from there, I think that helps. In general, I know that the way champions are made in League of Legends, because right, they're complex bits of code and design tools and whatnot, is you kind of start every champion and every ability as copying another ability in the game and then ripping things out that are required. Because why would you recode it's a skill shot that goes 1200 range when you can copy paste Mystic Shot and then rip out the cooldown mechanic, right? It's just better that way. But what that means though is anything that worked for another champion, yeah, Lissandra functions. Okay, we ripped in Lissandra's stats. And then no one really thought about Lissandra's attack speed growth. So, whoops, this is a champion attacks slowly, right? And obviously, Lux went through, 10 years of being in gameplay and having playtests and also being on live. And, it's not it's singularly this designer's fault for not buffing attack speed on Lux sooner. She's been this way for 9 years, or 10 years, or whatever it is. But, again, it feels weird that this attack-based champion has really poor attack speed. So, to me, I don't buy that her being slow was an intended weakness or an intended piece of the gameplay pattern. I think it always should have been reasonably reachable. Whatever, minor thing here. But again, The increased attack speed I think is quite valuable. It's going to help her obviously go reach her elimination procs and get that damage out. That's obviously a nice change. The ult cooldown, okay, it's the same at level 16, sure, but I mean this is a pretty aggressive cooldown. We're down to 1 minute at rank 1. Yeah, I mean pretty huge buffs to Lux. This should be several percent. Then we have the E buff, which is also quite meaningful. So yep, 10 flat damage, 17% at rank 1, 4% at rank 5. Not a huge deal late game, except for the fact that the AP ratio got buffed by 5%, which kind of keeps it a little bit flatter. So 15 AP per level is still my kind of benchmark ability power. I think at some point in the future, I'll start doing a sort of scaling growth, much like how base stats scale, since generally speaking, right, as it takes more and more time to level up, you're going to get more gold. And so you could probably do a parabolic AP growth. That might be in for the next patch's rundown. It'll be slightly more honest to how champions actually buy items and scale. Figure that out at some point in time. But anyway, just a random aside, a random thought. But what it comes down to is still the AP ratio is not so generous that a very small AP ratio buff of like 8%, right, is going to completely overtake the fact that it's a bigger base stat, it's a bigger base damage growth at 1 than it is a sort of like functional AP ratio growth at late game. Worth noting, because I want to include this every time I can, hey, what is the, how much ability power does it take to double the damage of this ability? And it's 386, which is actually pretty high. I talked about this in the last rundown when I was talking about Singed, but basically, AP ratios, to me, again, need to be between 300 and 400 for most champions to actually allow them to scale, 1, and to give them a reason to build ability power was the other one. Now, Lux has no reason to build anything but ability power. She doesn't want to build tank. She could build ability haste, but ability haste items have ability power on them. So like, okay, yeah, she's maybe more incentivized to go Cosmic Drive and Void Staff instead of maybe Death Cap and Horizon Focus. Because AP is not quite as generous on her, so you have that kind of build finagling, which again I find a little boring, but that's something I can talk about later on down the line. I'm not 100% sure that's actually true. But at the end of the day, it's not complete garbage, but the number at the bottom, the 400 in parentheses, that is a call out to the old base damage and the old ratio. It took 400 AP to double. So indeed, Lux's scaling wasn't very good. And people thought that Lux didn't scale very well. Well, again, low attack speed growth means that she wasn't getting really good access to her passive. And a relatively poor AP ratio on her E meant that she wasn't getting really good scaling on her primary damage ability. That said, obviously Lux can absolutely one-shot people, right? QER is a lot of damage and often one-shots. One of the big buffs that Riot gave 5 years ago was making the R pop illumination, and turns out that that's a lot of flat damage to add to a combo. And obviously you can say what you want about theoretical AP ratios, but Lux one-shots characters sometimes, and so the damage can only go so high. At what point is she allowed to one-shot is a relevant question. Again, very big Lux buffs overall. Should be pretty solid. Next up, Misfortune, getting some small nerfs. Obviously, she's taking over pro play. She's a big deal in solo queue as well. She is the premier marksman right now in League of Legends, as far as I can tell. And so, okay, it's like 35 or something base mana down. 15 mana cost up on Strut as well. So her like E spam and Q spam kind of gameplay style hasn't really changed. So her ability to just generally fight in lane and do the poke things hasn't gone down a whole lot. I mean, she's down like half a Q of base mana. Is not that big of a deal. It can matter, of course, but it's not that big of a deal. But this is obviously a pretty meaningful early game focused nerf. Yeah, she's quite a lane bully. Okay, that's fine. Strut mana cost, I think just finding a place to nerf mana without completely ruining her landing phase. Something that you're going to opt into a bit more as the Misfortune of like how much I'm going to use this. I can kind of accept that logic. It's pretty reasonable. So here's her mana pool before and after. Yeah, again, much more meaningful in the early game. She has 35 mana per level, by the way. Again, the number I like is 40. The way items are right now for 80 carries, Muramana scales off of your champion's total mana. So base mana is included, which means champions like Ezreal and Jace, if they have high base mana pools, they're not getting as much spell freedom, because getting 860 mana or whatever, right, would be a smaller percentage increase of your pool. It wouldn't double your mana pool because you already have a bunch of mana. But it does mean that their base mana feeds into this item giving a lot of AD. And that seems to be more and more what Mana Mune is kind of about, is like, well, I do need some more mana, but I don't care that it's only 40% more mana instead of 70% more mana. I care that, it's really, really an efficient source of AD. I'm not convinced that's the right place for this item to live. It just means that the right mana Moona users are champions with a lot of mana instead of the ones that have mana hooks in the kit where, Rise and like Kassadin feel good about getting mana because they have mana hooks and it feels more intentional than just my base stats are high. So that's, I think, where my thinking is kind of right now on mana itemization, that it should feel like something you are opting into, that there should be like another supporting piece somewhere, like a Frozen Heart, which, makes sense for Ezreal. Again, like that kind of makes sense, but, who else is building Frozen Heart? Something like that, right? Like that's kind of where my thinking is with mana itemization, that you want a kit hook and you probably want a secondary item that can make sense, that can feel correct in the build, and that I think in general, even if a build is completely prescribed, it's like I literally always go Rod of Ages Seraphs in every game ever on any mana champion ever, and there's never ever any choice. My understanding, or my feeling right now, is that actually that feels unique to players because they're not playing Rise 100% of all time. They're playing Rise sometimes, and his build is unique. And so it feels unique to build unique items, even if you're not making choices with items. It feels more and more like players don't actually want to make item choices. This is where I believe League actually is, and the League player base actually is that making item choices mid-build, for like smaller incomparables, like which one is more offense, that is not where players seem to want to make choices. And it might be that, League item design is still really not quite there. And I can maybe do a follow-up video on itemization where it's like if I was going to redesign all the items, here's how I'd do it. But in general, it feels like the decision sort of differences aren't rich enough for players to feel like really involved in the decision makings or in that decision making. And the other side of it is, yeah, so I think players just want their build to feel unique in the first place. They don't seem to want to make on-the-fly decisions, except for things like when do I buy a stopwatch, when do I go defense versus offense, but they don't want to make offensive decisions as far as I can tell, at least not very much, not in the middle of the game. They just want to know, is Lord Dominic's better than Collector? Yes, no, done, and just make one choice. That feels like where it is. So that's kind of where I think people are, and that's where I think we should meet them as a game. Anyway, yeah, Misfortune's Mace Mana is down. Next up is Quinn. Quinn is actually very OP. So Quinn is 3% above baseline win rate for her elo over the last month, at least for Plat Plus. I haven't checked any more than that, but again, it's an Oracle nerf where she tripped the sensors, right? Worth noting that people are countering her a fair bit. Her second most common matchup is Malphite. Indeed, the matchup is bad, and Quinn's win rate is still plus 3%. So she is doing really, really well. She's not actually being spammed as only a counter pick. If you look at her like top 6 most played matchups, her win rate delta is negative in 4 of them. Like she's positive in Fiora. People are identifying that Quinn Fiora is very, very good for her. But like Set and Aurelia and Malphite and one other is like slightly to, in the case of Malphite, very negative. So Quinn is not a counter pick only kind of champion. She just is very, 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 very strong. So deserved of a nerf. WMAX has become the most common skill order. And the most successful skill order, so WMAX is the build, and so here's her attacks per second. Now keep in mind, this is not her attacks per second always. This is her attacks per second when she triggers her passive, which is not all the time. So this nerf looks, pretty bad for her DPS, but it's not actually this bad in the real world because she's not always under this buff. Now, what this really means is when she's just generally clearing minions, it's, pretty flat. When she's in any PvP combat, if she's vaulting and autoing, then this is what's happening, right? In any realistic auto attack scenario where you are fighting an enemy champion, Q auto, E auto, whatever it's going to be, R auto, that's going to trigger the passive, and you are going to have this feel. So yeah, you're going to feel it pretty quickly from level 9 onwards. I know Quinn used to build a fair bit of crit before. It feels like we're really only on lethality right now. I didn't look that closely at her builds, to be honest, but this does push her slightly towards crit builds, because you feel attack speed nerfs less the more you already have. Next up is Sion. Yeah, the 10 flat shield on Sion W in the last patch was not a very big deal. It was thought that, certainly, 10 flat, health on a shield is not a very big deal. But the worry was that that spell is really, really volatile. So, compare it to, say, like 10 health on a Karma shield, it's just 10 health. But 10 health on a Sion shield, that means it lasts, it means you get the explosion, and you get twice the value of the ability. So W is really touchy to balance changes. That said, yeah, the last buff to Sion was not very good. I want to point out, though, before we go into the actual math on the changes, you can see a little bit of it down there. Sion's best build definitively is tank. Now, a very, very slim majority, like 52% of Sion players, are building him tank, by the way. They're going Sunfire Aegis or Frostfire Gauntlet. And that is, potentially the best build. It is the technically most common build is going Sunfire, and those builds are successful. And they're not great, but they're like balanced to slightly good. Going for Prowler's Claw or Yomu's Ghostblade or Hullbreaker, any one of those builds, all of those builds, each of those builds are sub 50% win rate. Lethality Sion is objectively weaker than Tank Sion. Now, there might be games where Lethality Sion is the better choice, but like we're at like 40% of games are Lethality Sion, and 52% are Tank Sion, 8% are in other builds. We'll get to that in a minute. And Lethality builds are like across the board completely far lower win rate. And you could try to make the case, it's like, well, it's only the part-time Sion players playing Lethality. It's like, no, it's not. Come on. Who's like, normally I'm a Riven one trick, but I'm gonna play Lethality Sion. No one's doing that, okay? Like, no. The point stands, Lethality Sion is honestly a fair bit weak. I don't think Riot should try to make Lethality Sion the correct Sion build. It can sit there at minus 3% win rate, and people can just do whatever they want to do. But this means that Sion's win rate is getting deflated by 40% of his games being in bad builds. The right build for Sion, and I am honestly shocked that people aren't going this way, because it's so obvious. Okay, people want to build a damage-focused Sion. Great. Did you know that you can kind of go for a damage-focused Sion because he prints free bonus health through his W passive? Are there damage items that scale off bonus health and attack damage? What would those be? Would that be Sterix Gauge and Titanic Hydra? Oh, those would be items that give a bunch of attack damage and scale off of bonus health. Why are no one building these things? Why? Like, there's clearly a market for Sion players who want to build damage, and he has obvious kit hooks for bonus health. Just do this build. Just do this build. It's the right build. Do the build. Truly, I promise you, the right build is going there. Like, this is the right way to go about it. Please build damage Sion. Build Sterix. Build Titanic. You will feel a lot better. Is his highest win rate build as far as I can tell. That's your build. I just realized, by the way, that because I was reading OBS wrong, I have lowered my mic level. So from now on, we're going to have a much better volume. Sorry about this. Hey, everyone. This is a bit better. I'm going to push a little bit higher. Yeah, okay. This is going to be my mic level for the rest of this. You probably are going to hear the laptop fan a bit more, but hopefully this is reasonable. All right, so let's go into what's actually changing with Sion, though, because he is gaining 2% max health on the shield. Okay, well, here is him with basically just his base stats. Worth noting that obviously, as he levels up, it gains more health. As the W ranks up, because he maxes second, the base value goes up, as does the health ratio, so it moves around a fair bit, but it starts and ends at about 10%. But we have some sort of quick math, and again, this is not going to be exactly accurate, because obviously Sion's going to get even more health than this, but if we assume he gains 100 bonus health per level through items and his W passive, well, what happens with Sion? Well, we go up and up and up and up, and his health total doubles, basically, because his base health is very low, because they wanted to maximize the W value, and I think it's totally fine. That makes sense. So it goes from like 1785, I think, max health level 18 to plus 1800. So again, truly doubling the health total. And that means we go from a 10% buff to a 12% buff. Not as big as you might think. Yeah, it turns out the base value is still pretty high as well. But yeah, as you buff the shield quite a bit, okay, 2% max health is not a bad gain. Yeah, this should be pretty meaningful with Sion, right? His shield is just 10 to 15% stronger at almost all points in the game. Seems good. Next up, buffs to Teemo. Pretty much exclusively just buffs to Blinding Dart, 1 second with the cooldown, half second up on the duration, and the missile speed is much higher, so, maybe the reactive spell shield or riposte or whatever isn't going to be quite as good. In general, I think it's good to have high missile speeds for targeted abilities. I just don't think they need to live in the air for that long. I think I don't know, it just feels right to me. I don't know why, but I'm generally a fan of fairly fast missile speeds. I think it just makes abilities feel punchier. I think that's the big thing. It also gives them a slightly higher chance at getting the blind in time before someone auto-attacks him. So Jax is flying in, or Fiora's going to go in for a lunge or something. As soon as the blind hits, now they're blinded. That can kind of help Teemo. Yeah, that seems pretty big. Obviously, damage isn't really any higher. Obviously, cooldown can be helpful, 7 seconds. in general, right? League keeps going in a direction of lower and lower cooldowns. The game is getting a little bit faster. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but certainly the game is quite a lot different from what it was in 2012 or something. As cooldowns get shorter and shorter, again, that can be okay. Just it's of note, that's the direction we're going, right? I think it's fine. But yeah, pretty solid buffs to Teemo. Again, not the poke isn't any better. The DPS isn't really any better in most fight situations, but the half-second longer blind helps his 1v1s when someone tries to get him. Next up is, so here's the data table of the blind duration. Not any huge surprises here. Again, I don't think this is actually a huge buff. It's 3 lines of text, but none of them are that important. Viego is getting buffed. He is not doing all that well. He is getting played in Pro, though, so I think he's like slightly weak in solo queue, but he's obviously really seen in Pro a fair bit. So they're saying, okay, well, we can keep buffing the crit build by buffing the Heartbreaker crit ratio. Spectral Maul is going to have slightly weaker self-slow, and Q has 10% increased total AD ratio. So Q has a base damage of 15 per rank. It also has a total AD ratio of 0.6 becoming 0.7. And so because it's total AD, it means it counts as base AD and his item growth. So here is his numbers from base AD. Right, it's up 12% to 8% as we go to late game. Obviously, right, the smallest amount of the buff is at level 9, where you max the ability, and then as you level up, you gain more AD. But as we look towards a more real-world scenario, we're getting 10 attack per level, 180 bonus AD at level 18, which lines up reasonably with how runes are going to work and item buys and whatnot. It's close enough to the real world that we can just use it. What we end up with is a solid. I don't know what this is. A bigger buff, right? Because as he gets more AD, it's more like 12% in late game, which means again starts and ends with 12%. The more AD you buy, the higher this goes. I mean, this is using 180 bonus AD at the late game, and that's 3 items, about right, 60 each, about 3 items. That's like roughly accurate, so it's not like really that far off from the real world. But if you ever go to 4 items or 5 items, it's beyond that, obviously. All right, yeah, pretty moderate buffs, obviously, like. Viego should feel pretty good, and he still pushes towards the crit builds. Next up is Xayah. As I mentioned, Xayah is getting some buffs to try to... this is kind of a weird self-fulfilling prophecy. So again, I want to be really clear in that I do like these changes. I think it's actually very smart. I'm a fan of Riot trying to design champions in a way where you have choice of ability rank. I think that's just cool. Even if you decide you want to choose it every single game forever, having the ability of being like, well, I'm actually a Qmax second Xayah, I think is interesting. So in general, Qmax first Xayah is by far her weakest build. And it's never going to get there, I don't think. Emax is too good. There's no way to get around it. And that's fine, right? It could be okay to have an obvious max first that's just like core to the champion, and you just play it that way. I think it's totally okay. Like I don't think everything has to be, all 6 permutations or whatever. But the important point is, wouldn't it be nice if W versus Q second was a possibility? So, right, here's the Q rank up of, instead of 6 seconds, 4 seconds of max rank. That is a really, really big incentive to max Q. Most games don't end at level 18. So it's like, well, really, I can make a choice. Do I really want a super, super short Q cooldown? This is the most feathers I can possibly get is casting Q. Q itself gives me 2 feathers, plus the passive buff for 3, and the cooldown's only 4 seconds. I'm going to have a lot of extra feathers this way. This is ostensibly a caster build DPS increase. This is kind of interesting. Xayah's overall win rate is not horrible. As I mentioned on the Worlds broadcast a day or so ago, the real tech with Xayah is running Halo Blades. That has been consistently your highest win rate keystone for several months. It actually fits her combat pattern quite nicely. Literally press any button, like W, auto attack 3 times, press E. It lines up with her passive durations. It lines up with Halo Blades. It lines up with getting a root afterwards. It allows you to actually get the root quickly in the fight, which lets you like get out if you need to, or Q auto really fast and get stuff done. Like there's a lot of value in just like getting a short trade, because all Xayah wants to do, right, is short trade, right? She wants to like stack up some daggers and then pull E back and be done with it. Okay, I cast Q. Okay, I cast W. I'll use my W stack speed duration and then I'm done. But she's really front loaded. Lethal tempo doesn't line up with her play pattern very well. Lethal tempo, like you could call it a strength, but I think it's a weakness. Lethal tempo gets popped all the time in lane by just pressing Q. Like, I want to shove the wave. Okay, and I popped, and it hit Ezreal for 12 damage, and I popped lethal tempo, and so I have 2 seconds of fast attacking on minions, and so I slightly, quickly wave clear. And now it's down if they want to fight me. And I have no control over my ability to actually have my keystone available for the battles, because I pop lethal tempo on accident constantly. And I just think that's actually a negative for her. where I think she's better off going things like Conqueror, where she has some control over herself. Because hey, by the way, right, if you're landing spells, you're getting buffs up, and you can kind of do okay with the AD stacking that way. Again, she wants AD ratios everywhere. Every one of her abilities basically has an AD ratio on it. QW, E, and R all have AD ratios functionally because attack speed's an AD ratio. But yeah, the best build of all of them is going Halo Blades, and it just fits her trading pattern. Also, she gets 5 move speed, which is kind of nice. At the end of the day, what this is going to mean for Xayah, as we just kind of take a look at what this matters. Again, you're probably just going to still max it second, but this does close the gap. Sorry, you're still going to max it last, but it does close the gap a bit against maxing it second. There is a chance you go for that build instead. In games where you do go for the late game, 14, 15, 16, you are going to feel a slightly lower cooldown on the ability. That's going to be a small buff as well. I think these are all fine. But ultimately, the real buff in this patch is going to be the 5 move speed, because ultimately, if Xayah really needs a win rate gain, a buff from level 14 onwards is not going to really do it, which, again, is why I'm a fan of the move speed change. And just a fan of the Q change, because it does maybe give some build diversity. Now, what I said at the very beginning is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, is some of Xayah's win rate loss is people are building her incorrectly. Now, I know the designer has the data on, what's the W max, the E max, W max win rate, it's not hard to be aware of what the win rates are when built properly. The most common builds are still E into W, but it's okay, well, there's still win rate differences in W versus Q, so go that way. But the self-fulfilling prophecy is the more we buff Q max, the more people are going to go towards inferior builds, which is kind of weird. All right, so set of changes now to Ironspike whip items. So Goredrinker is going from a total AD ratio to a base AD ratio. The health regen is now going to Omnivamp, and you no longer get 15% bonus AD as you are low on health. Ironspike whip goes from 75 total AD to 100 base AD, and Stridebreaker gets the same change from 100 total AD to 75 base AD, but also gets 5 attack damage on top. So what this means is this is our before and after on Goredrinker, and our before and after on Stridebreaker. And I'm a very big fan of the design changes here. Okay, so here is what's going on. There's several changes there's several basic problems that are all getting fixed pretty well with these changes, and I like them all. Okay, number 1, a problem of identity. Goredrinker was the best durability item and the best damage item. Despite the fact that Stridebreaker had more attack speed and less health, it was the worst damage item. The worst DPS item, because Goredrinker had the Spite passive and the same total AD, so why would you ever go for Stridebreaker when you can just get 15% more attack damage, which makes your active better, which makes your auto attacks better, which makes your spells better. It's very clear that Goredrinker is always going to do more damage than Stridebreaker, so it's the better tanky item and the better offensive item. Why do I build Stridebreaker ever? For an on-demand slow? It's the only reason at all to go Stridebreaker. And yeah, when it was really OP, people went Stridebreaker. And then it got nerfed to being a reasonable item, and it's like, oh yeah, right. Goredrinker is so over... Like, to emphasize how OP Stridebreaker was when they buffed the slow, Goredrinker is busted. This item is so overpowered. And Stridebreaker was more powerful than that, right? Now Stridebreaker is relatively balanced, and it's yep, Goredrinker is just OP. So, number 1, they fixed the problem of Goredrinker is also the damage item. Yeah, okay, 1.75 base AD, Thirsting Slash or whatever isn't. We'll get to the math on that later on down the line, but Stridebreaker now has attack speed, and Goredrinker doesn't, and it has more attack damage than Goredrinker does. Goredrinker has more health, Goredrinker has Omnivamp. Okay, now we're going somewhere, right? Now we're in a world where, okay, we actually have different items. I wouldn't have minded, by the way, Goredrinker's Thirsting Slash going actually lower in damage and letting Stridebreaker also have the higher active. Wouldn't have minded it. That said, I think there can eventually be a version 2 of these changes. I'm still a very big fan of these changes, but it allows Goredrinker to be like, hey, look, Goredrinker is still a fighter item. It's still 45 AD. It's got some Omnivamp. I've got an active with damage on it. This is clearly a damage-focused item, but it is the tankier of the options. It is clearly the sustain option. I'm turning my damage into Omnivamp, right? So this is not the item that Maokai buys, because he's not really going to Omnivamp. He's not really scaling off of attack damage. He's not going to get there. The point of a heavy fighter is to deal damage and be tanky, and Goredrinker does those things, but it skews towards the tanky. We have Stridebreaker here, who skews towards the offense, right? It skews towards, I'm going to lock you down. I run faster, you run slower, I have attack speed, I have more AD. Stridebreaker lives in that world a lot better. I am, again, a fan of items that occupy a similar stat profile as possible, that then let you accentuate their differences. It's the problem that I had with the previous version of Goredrinker and Stridebreaker, where Stridebreaker had attack speed, but Goredrinker just had damage on low health. So like they're just competing in a damage space. And it's like, which one should I really go for? Like, this is really troll. But now it's a lot more obvious. Stridebreaker has more AD, it has attack speed, it has move speed. Goredrinker has health, has sustain, has sustain. Okay, got it, right? And so it actually says, okay, if I'm going to choose between them, I now have obvious things where this obviously does this more than the other one, and it does that more than the other one, and that's good. So, good set of changes there. But yeah, the reason I bring up there should be version 2 of these changes at some point, and I mean, this is me not being inventive, this is the designer saying it himself. He's not convinced that a slow should be the output of the damage-focused fighter mythic. That said, we still have Trinity Force and Divine Sunder as damage-focused fighter mythics, where they don't do any lockdown, they just deal more damage. I would really not mind, I would not mind Trinity Force being in a spot where its numbers were very close to Stridebreaker. And think about the numbers here, right? Like, it's actually so wild that we're back to base AD, because base AD is the Sheen proc, right? Triforce is a much lower cooldown than Stridebreaker. Okay, so Goredrinker is the tanky option. Stridebreaker, by comparison, is the damage option, but it's also the lockdown option. And if we compare Stridebreaker to Trinity Force, I would should have the same AD and the same attack speed as Stridebreaker. Like, if anything, Stridebreaker should maybe go to like 40 and 30 so that Triforce can kind of meet it there. But then Triforce, right, can be the beatdown one. It's the more damage-focused one. Stridebreaker could maybe the Mythic passive is actually the halting slash slows her more. I actually am a fan of the Mythic passive on the Mythic passive on Frostfire Gauntlet, I believe, feeds into its own slow. It's like slow field size. And the Mythic passive on Aegis of the Legion feeds into how strong its AoE armor and MR aura is. I'm actually a really big fan of that for Mythic passive, by the way. Mythic passive actually reinforces the Mythic itself. I think it's really cool. I'm actually a fan of Luden's Tempest and Rocket Belt having flat pen and flat pen, because it's the only source of flat pen in the game outside of Zork Shoes, and as you build more, it goes more into flat pen, right? It's the assassination version of the item. Like, I think it's really clever. I actually would really like, and obviously it does to a fair bit, right? The Mythic passives often do reinforce the item itself, but like, I wouldn't mind if Goredrinker's Mythic passive was Omnivamp. I mean, we have that with, what's it called? Riftmaker, I think. Like, I think that's actually really good. I would actually more and more be a fan of Mythic passives being a stat on the item and the unique stat of the item itself. Omnivamp is unique to Goredrinker. That's its Mythic passive. A slow is the unique part of Stridebreaker. That's the Mythic passive. The move speed on hit on Trinity Force. That's the Mythic passive, right? Like, that to me seems really interesting and is where I would take these items if we're going to do version 2 of Mythics. Actually, I like it so much, I will pitch it to the designers. We'll see if they like it for some time next season, because I think it's actually the right way for the items to go. But again, to circle back to it, and at some point, yeah, Stridebreaker and Trinity Force are now crowding each other a very little bit. Again, you want to find some differentiation there. But one thing that happens with it being base AD is, again, it's now fighting on the same terms as Sheen, and Sheen is better. Trinity Force 2.0 base AD is better. Not Sheen is actually worse. The other thing this does, though, so the second big thing this does that I mentioned at the very beginning is this pushes it away a little bit from. So here's actually, we'll talk about it in a second, because here's Ironspike Whip. Basically, Ironspike Whip, if nerfed, it is nerfed. If you were late to get to your Mythic, then it's not quite so bad. It's better at level 9 or 10 or 11 or whatever. But you can only ever buy one Ironspike Whip, and it turns into Goredrinker or Stridebreaker, an item that you're pretty much always buying first. And so, lo and behold, now if you want to do a Yomu's Ghostplate into Goredrinker kind of build for like a Kiana or a Zed or something, then okay, lo and behold, you can rush Yomu's. And then if you go Ironspike Whip second, then actually it's slightly stronger. Congratulations, it's a slightly better item. This, by the way, is using Lee Sin as our example champion. Lee Sin is the most played champion who builds a Goredrinker, so I picked Lee Sin as our example champ, because obviously everyone's base stats are different, then it's just going to be different per champion, so who knows. But doing this here. But here's the other side of it. So here's what I'm talking about. So this is using Goredrinker at full health or Stridebreaker at any time pre-patch. This is the conversion from 1.0 total AD to 1.75 base AD. These items were getting poached by assassins, and this is a problem, because it turns out the highest damage assassin mythic is a fighter mythic. Because when you scale your total attack damage 1.0, it is a better active than you get from Duskblade. It is a better active than you get from Prowler's Claw. And you should just go Goredrinker on talent, and it's more damage. That, to me, is a problem. I don't mind, like, saying, oh, actually, this draft isn't so good for me. I should go a little bit tankier. I grabbed Talon early, and they went Braum, Ezreal, and, they got a Locket, and everyone got Ninja Tabbies, and I'm like, okay, yeah, we can't build lethality. That's fine. I'm totally down for the option of going Bruiser on Assassins. I think it's completely reasonable to say, actually, we're going Goredrinker and we're getting a Black Cleaver and going to move on. I think it's totally fine. The problem I have is when you're going, Yomu's Edge of Night, Umbral Glaive, Goredrinker. Like, well, something's wrong here because you clearly want to be an assassin, and Goredrinker is the best way to be an assassin. That's a problem. So again, Goredrinker giving 15% more attack damage. That's a problem. That's not a good thing. Its active being 1.0 total AD is the highest damage active in the game. That's not a good thing. So it's 1.75 base AD instead, and you can see here, okay, certainly if all you have is this item, the item is actually buffed. Now, if you're Lee Sin, the item is actually buffed. Lee Sin has pretty high base AD, I think it's like 68. He has reasonably high growth of around 3.5. His AD at level 18 is like 120 something. Like, it's quite high, but it's not that high for an AD melee champion. AD melee champions tend to have high base AD because, like, they're all that way to have Sheen synergy. Basically, it makes total sense. I'm about it. It's a very reasonable thing to have happen. But basically, what it comes down to is, okay, well, what is the difference in damage? And I believe if I did this correctly, bonus AD to nerf at 22 bonus AD from runes, masteries, items, right, which is Adorn's Blade and Conqueror stacks, and I built the Phage on the Sterix gauge. Oh, well, it's a nerf now, right? Tell me a level 15 champion who doesn't have 40 bonus AD, which is literally any item ever, plus runes. So in any realistic scenario, as time goes on, Goredrinker and Stridebreaker are going to be less of the damage profile. I myself play a lot of Nocturne. I run Conqueror Nocturne. It's correct there, by the way. Your Q gives you like 45 or 55 something bonus AD. Nocturne is getting directly nerfed by these changes, so I might need a new one trick if I want to get back to Diamond this season. But whatever. Meaningful change here. Okay. But then we go into the bigger sets of numbers, which is the Goredrinker when you're low, right? The 15% bonus AD maxes out at 75% missing health. It actually activates, relatively early on, which is part of why this item's so good. Is you get that scaling pretty quickly, and it's linear, right? So if you're at half health, you're getting what, 2/3? You're at half health, you get 10% more attack damage. Yeah, no wonder everyone's buying this item. It's just absurdly busted, so I'm glad the Spite pass is getting removed, because that passive is dumb. Yeah, it takes 2 bonus AD at level 8. Yeah, right? This is objectively just, like, absolutely a nerf to Goredrinker, and by comparison, right, it is less of a nerf to Stridebreaker, because Stridebreaker never got the Spite passive. It is definitely a nerf to Goredrinker, right? So you go back to here, and it's like, okay, yeah. So Goredrinker, 150% health regen. You could maybe call it 450 gold worth of regen. That's what the rejuve beads cost. Omnivamp I just priced at 2x lifesteal as just like an idea. Okay, well that's where it lands. Very efficient item. Yep, 113% gold efficient. Wow, efficiency went up, but like you lost Spite, and Spite is such a very big deal. Thirsting Slash is like definitively weaker as a result of all of the changes overall. So you have less Thirsting Slash damage, you have less total AD for your abilities. It is definitively weaker. Stridebreaker, of course, gained 5 AD. Its active didn't get as obviously nerfed. It's a lot flatter there. Okay, let's move on to the next change, which is Conqueror got itself nerfed. 2 to 4 adaptive force, 2 to 5 adaptive force became 2 to 4 adaptive force. This is what you would get in ability power. Almost no mages run Conqueror. You get 60% of this in attack damage, and the max stack is 12. The buff duration is lower, but that's not going to be that big of a deal. It just means it'll fall off in the middle of waves while you're fighting, so it means, a Maokai or something doesn't have to hide away as long to wait out the Conqueror falling off to be able to fight for the wave again. But here's the math. Here is Conqueror, again, using Lee Sin as our most common Conqueror user champion. The left-hand side is simply your bonus AD before and after. 36 becomes 29. I'm sure there's a decimal there, but whatever. It's 20% lower because 20% off of 5 is 4. No duh. Okay, great. But as the actual champion, I'm not sure what the no and yes is, but whatever. Who cares? Conqueror before and after gives you, again, that same 7 less AD, which is, again, not gigantic, right? It's not that big of a change, actually, but it's a small nerf. Okay, fine. Moving on, we have Guardian. So we have Guardian going on here, and Guardian is getting 20 less on the shield. The ratios are all the same, 15% ability power, 9% bonus health. Those are all the same, but yes, Guardian is doing a bit too well. It is, in fact, cutting out the other keystones. Every enchanter should always run Guardian at all times, unless you are a bit more offensive focused. You can consider things like Aerie on Nami. Guardian, by the way, is also quite good on Nami, but whatever. But yeah, Guardian is so good. Turns out 70 base health at level 1 makes you basically unkillable. The counterplay to enchanters is to all in them, and you cannot all in a Guardian enchanter. It is not possible. They will survive you. So yeah, I don't mind this scaling it more heavily. Keep in mind, like I wouldn't mind it being pretty much the exact scaling as the health shard rune, which by the way is next up in the change list. Because yeah, that thing needed the help, and yeah, I wouldn't mind health stuff scaling more aggressively, unless again the design could totally be for all keystones that they're more early game focused and that they shouldn't scale as hard. That's actually totally reasonable as a piece of logic, but off we go. So here's the shield size before and after, 20% or 20 flat off. Obviously, it's going to matter much more in the early game. Keep in mind, there's also a health and AP scaling, so it really does change a lot. So here's the health chart. Same at level 1, but pretty much 50% larger at level 18. Much very important here. This is one thing that I wish Riot did a better job of keeping up on. I know that they have data on rune pick rates and rune win rates overall. So for example, later on we're going to have one on Ravenous Hydra, and Ravenous Hydra is not an overall very high win rate rune, but I think the important thing truly, and I really, really mean this as someone, even though I love my numbers and I love my balances and whatnot, balance is less important than player perception by far, right? It does not matter what's actually strong or actually winning. It's what players believe to be good matters. And that's why pick rate is such a valuable commodity. That's why, pick and ban rate in pro. That's why people keep using Riven's got a 50% win rate and a 35% pick rate. It's been that way for 7 years. It's like, yeah, she's popular and pretty good. But people care so much about the popularity factor that they quote it every single time. I haven't seen a single win rate complaint post without pick rate attached. Literally ever. Ever once, right? People actually always use pick rate. Because popularity, turns out, it sticks in our minds. Because it's a champion that we see very frequently. It's a champion that we fight against often. Champion, and just in general, even if, right, there's a reason no one cares about Aurelion Sol being overpowered, because they don't play against him. And even though Akali isn't overpowered, people play against her all the time, and she's a bit frustrating, and so, Akali's complained about. And I get it, right? And so it doesn't matter what's actually strong. What matters is player choice. And so when you see keystones, when you see runes, when you see stat shards, and the pick rates are out of whack, it doesn't really matter unless you have design reasons to want something to be under or overpicked, which I think is totally valid. That's okay. In some cases you have champions like Yasuo who just are popular, and Akali, etc. But in the case of runes, no one's really going to be emotionally attached to runes. So you can push really hard to make these rune shards comparable. And say, well, Health Shard has a 5% pick rate. This could have been buffed in the first month of the season by just looking at the report and being like, oh yeah, the pick rate's too low, and just doing it. And I actually, the more I think about this, and I thought that was before because I was thinking about making this point when I was building out the patch rundown. I truly, truly, truly believe Riot should ignore win rate data initially when buffing and nerfing runes and items. They should look. Okay, maybe not ignore, that's maybe too strong of a term, but 90% should look purely at pick rate data and get them to equal. Because, right, you get them to equal. You get it to 30, 30, 35, 35, 35. I know that's not the actual numbers. You get it to 1/3 armor, MR, health, stat shards, and say, we got them equal. People are picking them equally, just across League of Legends. I don't care if it's per role, you shouldn't do it per role, that's fine. But across League of Legends, they have equal pick rates. Get people there. And then you now know people are willing to accept each rune, right? Now that people pick them all equivalently in general across the population, and now they're going to be like, okay, I know I can pick into these 3. I know as a player, my perception is these are all very good. These are all balanced. I'm now going to make good choices based on what I'm against, right? Because now I'm convinced that the health shard is valuable. It is worth taking. The MR shard is worth taking. And now that you have that happening, then you can say, okay, then you can start measuring behavior. Then you can start measuring win rate. Then you can start saying, okay, is something getting out of whack? But for something like this, where they're just numbers on a spreadsheet, basically, you can just push that stuff, I think, and get people into some decent spots. I really think you could do that, right? I think that wouldn't be that big of a deal. I don't think you break the game by making the health shard slightly OP for 2 patches. when it's like, look, you can just be heavily reactive, instantly go for big buffs or big nerfs on runes getting overpicked and underpicked, and then like, congratulations, you've built riches in the game by just being willing to commit to a second set of changes in a month. So I think there's a lot of that Riot could do, and should be doing, is looking at the choice systems in the game, right? Runes and items, and just almost going overboard, with pure balancers. Like as long as you're fine with the design of the item, I think a design of Health Shard is fine. It's a compelling design. I think it's an interesting design. It's not absurdly rich, but like, yeah, I pick armor at 1 versus scaling health is a cool choice. It is a good choice for where it is in the systems of League of Legends. Why did we wait a year for this to be an actual choice, right? Like why? It's a ball that was dropped. It's not a very important thing. Like no one's quitting League because they can't go health shards, but like this is the kind of thing I wish Riot spent more time looking at. All right, next up is the actual math on health shard. Here we go. Okay. Here's what yes and no is from. Because I did the Conqueror one later, so it's copy pasted from this data table. So here's the health before and after, right? 15 to 15, 90 to 140, 50% more health. It's a very, very large health increase. Obviously, a pretty valuable thing here. But the important one is now in the real world in 11.21. If I run this rune, if I didn't run the rune and now I run the buffed rune, because I don't really care about how buffed it is before and after on my champion. I don't actually really care. What I care about is thinking that I have the idea that I can go 6 armor, or I can go 8 MR, or I can go for this scaling health rune. So I pick an example champion that has 585 health and 85 health per level, which puts me to 2030. And the fact that I can gain 140 health means I can gain 7% more max health at the end of the game. That's going to be more durability than armor or MR at that point in time. Like by level 10, this is absolutely more durability than those armor or MR runes. Unless we're going against like a Sword Shoe stacker or lethality stacker, which is like an acceptable choice to make that choice. But like these are the numbers that it should always have been. Like it should always have been 7% more health. Because like 6 armor, 8 MR, that's about 7% more X. And yeah, it's against half of stuff, but like, yeah, this is about where the number should be. This seems pretty good. Hopefully we actually get some decisions here. Next up is, again, I kind of like this. So win rate be damned, pick rate is what's important. Ravenous Hunter is overpicked, and if anything, because Riot is making more of a stand at finally lowering sustain in the game. So people did, someone on the gameplay team did a report of comparing, I want to say around like 2016 or 2015 or something, Rune and Mastery Sustain to 2021 Rune and Mastery Sustain, and it's wild. It's so different. There's so much more healing in League of Legends, and I know you all watching know this, but I wish this didn't get crept so heavily. But there's such a sustain creep in the game, that people have kind of properly identified. Like, yeah, it feels kind of overbearing. So okay, on the one hand, we get the Ingenious Hunter buff because again, no one picks this thing, and yeah, we should buff it to the point where it feels good to pick. This buffs things like Trinity Force. This buff things like Goredrinker and Stridebreaker. It's wild the fact that. And it was an intentional design choice, and so I can respect that. But like Goredrinker and Stridebreaker scale off of ability haste, because the designer wanted fighters to be able to use their fighter items more actively, and using ability haste as a core stat on fighters, and just like having it be up twice a fight. And that was an intentional choice. It wasn't an accident. It's like, okay, you did it on purpose. Okay, whatever. I'm not gonna say you're like dumb or wrong or anything, because I don't believe you are either of those things. But it also meant that Ingenious Hunter had one fewer user. And again, okay, right. If the point of runes is to be picked, let's buff runes. And the more they're picked, no one plays Ingenious Hunter. Let's buff it to where it's picked. Let's go. So base item haste goes from 10 to 20. Haste per stack goes from 5 to 6. So the total haste goes from 35 to 50, which is obviously a pretty big deal. Next change beyond that is Ravenous Hunter. As I mentioned, getting overpicked. Now instead of 7.5, it's only 6% Omnivamp. It's now living in a much more sort of realm of reality here. 6% Omnivamp is about what I would expect to cap out on a rune here. And I want to be clear, like, I think it's totally okay if Ravenous Hunter's resting win rate is low. It is on average weak for players because it's overpicked. Like, go ahead and kick players in the teeth and tell them stop picking this rune. Go pick it like a fair number of times. Give it another 20% less Omnivamp, and get people off the rune. Get them off the rune, right? Get them to pick other things, right? I know one thing people are bringing up is like, oh, as a mage, I'm so screwed because it's getting abused by the AD carries. The AD carries running Ravenous Hunter, so Ravenous Hunter's got to be nerfed because the AD carries are running it. It's like, dude, AD carries could be running. Like they can run Legend Bloodline, and they can go run like Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm and just get a bunch of free attack damage. Like, they should also be allowed to make choices and be forced to make choices. And whatever else. And like the exact same choice, of course, can be made for mages as well, right? They can also run Absolute Focus and whatnot. Like, you don't, like, running Sustain should not be the automatic choice. Like, period. Like, actually, I believe that. Running Sustain should not be the automatic choice. Like, there's a reason that Bloodthirster exists and is bought in, like, every 25 games for an 80 carry. Bloodthirster is a completely reasonable second item to buy. The stat profile is fine. It's got a fat shield. It's got lifesteal. It's got attack damage. You can stack it with a shield bow. You can, if you went Kraken Slayer and like, ah, crap, but the Assassin's Fed, you can go for it later. You can stack it with a Maw. I actually wish there was a crit Maw, by the way. I think that would be a great item that Riot should include in the game. And it's like, yeah, I went, like, these should all be defensible options. But it's like, well, nope. I got all my lifesteal from the rune system, so yeah, it should cap lower. And that's fine, right? Opting into lifesteal, opting into vamp should, like, first of all, right, let's get the pick rate down so it's not the most common option in every tree. And then they can, pick numbers to where it is choosable in situations where you need the sustain. And that means they can put it back to where these things give lifesteal level 1. And it's like, actually, this is a really poke-focused lane, and I'm going to take a lot of poke this game. I need early vamp to survive a karma. Like, that's fine. Like, that's a good place for those runes to live, to start a little bit higher and scale less heavily, which still preserves the Bloodthirster option. It still preserves the I actually wish there was more Omnivamp options for mages than just Riftmaker, but even then, like, at least there is an option to go for some kind of Omnivamp. So yeah, that's kind of where I wish items lived with lifesteal. Really, I don't know if lifesteal runes should exist at all in the game, and it should always be items, but I'm not 100% sure that's actually true. Anyway, here is the data table for both of those. Obviously, Ravenous Hunter nerfed by 20%. Ingenious Hunter buffed by quite a bit. Obviously, what it provides is twice as good, but you're casting 8% more spells. I could have put it out that way, as how many more spells you're really casting, or more items you're casting. End of the day, that's the math. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do a TLDR on this one. Going back up and kind of ticking up all the items has been awkward enough for me. So that's it for the patch rundown. Hopefully it was enjoyable. Hopefully this wasn't a completely horrible viewing experience. We went, just over an hour, as I do. I hope this was enjoyable. World's quarterfinals starts this Friday. I'll be on 2 of the days, actually. I'll be casting one of the sets, and I'll be on the analyst desk for Cloud9, which should be a lot of fun. So I'll have to do a bunch of prep for that. Because as a player-I-play, you don't have to prep nearly as hard as you do as a pure analyst. So be looking at pick ban stuff for the first time in a while. So that'll be fun. See you guys later. Bye-bye.